I arrived. It was my first day at the office, and the icy atmosphere wasn't just because of the Canadian winter outside. As soon as I stepped into the impeccably clean hallway, I felt the weight of the silence. People were absorbed in their tasks, eyes fixed on screens, fingers dancing over keyboards in a precise rhythm. No smiles, no nods, no small talk. The silence was only broken by short, direct questions, always about work. Nothing beyond the necessary. Coldness. That was the tone of the place. I didn't know why yet, but that was how Alexander Beaumont wanted it. The office was an exact reflection of how he was. I took a deep breath, adjusting my bag on my shoulder, trying to prepare myself for whatever was to come. I walked to the reception desk, where a woman with her hair in a perfectly neat bun looked at me without expression. "Hello, I'm Emily Carter, the new secretary for Mr. Beaumont." She just nodded, as if I were just another item on her daily checklist. "Last door on the right. He doesn't like people to knock. You can go in. Oh, right? Thank you." The woman was already back to her computer before I even finished speaking. Okay, no warm welcomes. I'd have to get used to that. I walked down the hallway in silence, trying to stay calm. The glass walls displayed impeccably organized offices. No plants, no family photos, no sign of personal life. Everything was cold, clean, distant. In front of the door with the name Alexander Beaumont engraved in silver letters, I hesitated for a second. He doesn't like people to knock. All right. I entered quietly, trying not to make a sound. He was there, standing with his back to me, facing a huge window that displayed snow-covered Toronto. It was as if time outside had frozen, as motionless as he was. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he spoke in a calm, almost monotone voice. "You're the new secretary." I straightened up. "Yes, sir. Emily Carter." Alexander turned slowly. He was tall and lean, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit. His pale face had angular features, and his eyes, those blue eyes, were cold, but not in the way I expected. There was no arrogance in them, no impatience, just emptiness. He looked at me for a moment that felt far too long, as if trying to remember how to interact with another human being. Then, he pointed to the desk next to his, cluttered with disorganized papers. "That's your desk. Start by organizing those documents. If you need anything, I'll be here." I expected a list of rules, demands for efficiency, something. But he just turned back to the window, ending the conversation as quickly as it started. I stood there, not knowing what to say. I approached the desk and began organizing the papers, trying to make as little noise as possible. For a while, the only sounds were the soft rustling of pages and the wind outside, howling against the windows. He didn't move or say anything. It was as if I wasn't even there. I didn't know what to think. Alexander Beaumont had a reputation for being ruthless in business, cold and calculating. But in that moment, I didn't see a tyrant. I saw someone exhausted, as if the weight of the world was on those perfectly straight shoulders. I continued my work in silence, trying not to overthink it. After all, it was only my first day. In the middle of the morning, I heard a noise outside. I looked and saw a colleague across the hall dropping a stack of folders, papers scattered across the floor, sliding like dried leaves. No one looked at him, no one offered to help. It was instinctive. I stood up and went over, kneeling beside him. "Let me help. It'll be quicker this way." The man looked at me as if I had 3 heads. He glanced around, then back at me, visibly confused. "No problem." I smiled, picking up the papers. Everyone has clumsy days. We gathered everything in silence, and when we were done, I returned to my desk. I didn't think much of it. Helping someone was natural for me. I didn't see anything special about it. But when I looked up, I realized that Alexander had turned away from the window. He was watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, but not with anger or disapproval. It was a curious look, almost intrigued. As if he couldn't understand what I had just done. Our eyes met for a second, and I could almost swear that I saw something crack in the coldness of his gaze. But then he looked away, turning back to the window as if nothing had happened. I tried to ignore the knot that formed in my stomach. I went back to work, organizing the papers in silence. But the image of him standing there, so still, so lonely, didn't leave my mind. It was as if he had been frozen in that place for a long time, unable to leave. I had no idea what had happened to Alexander Beaumont to make him that way. But, for the first time, I wondered if anyone had ever stopped to try to understand. I was determined to do a good job, even with the cold atmosphere of that place. No one talked, no one smiled. People walked through the hallways like shadows, passing by each other without exchanging a single glance. But what bothered me the most was the loneliness I saw in Alexander. In the days that followed, I kept the routine of leaving a hot coffee on his desk every morning. I did it quietly, trying not to draw too much attention. He never thanked me, but he never complained either. Sometimes I would see him holding the mug, watching the steam rise slowly, his eyes lost somewhere far away. I couldn't help but watch him. I tried to be discreet, of course, but there was something about him that caught my attention. The way he stood by the window for long minutes, motionless like a statue, made me wonder what held him there so tightly. It was always the same. He arrived early, took off his dark coat with slow movements, hung it perfectly on the coat rack, and then walked to the window. He would stand there for an endless amount of time, looking out at the snow-covered city, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture impeccable. There was something melancholic about that scene. He looked so alone, so lost, I couldn't help it. The more I watched him, the more I wanted to understand him. But I knew my place. I kept my distance, respected his space. I organized the papers, managed his schedule, answered calls. I did everything perfectly, never interrupting him. One day, while I was finishing filing some documents, I heard a sigh, a low, almost imperceptible sound. I looked at the slightly open door and saw him sitting at his desk, his head bowed, his fingers pressing against his temples. My heart tightened. He looked so tired. Without thinking much, I went to the kitchen and made another fresh coffee. When I returned, I knocked lightly on the door before entering. "Mr. Beaumont?" He slowly raised his head, his eyes unfocused. He looked like he had been pulled out of a bad dream. "Yes. I thought a coffee might help." I placed the mug next to the messy papers. "It's fresh." Alexander looked at the cup for a moment, as if trying to understand why it was there. His eyes moved back to me, and I felt a chill in my stomach when our gazes met. I had never noticed how blue his eyes were, an icy blue but deep, like the sea on a cloudy day. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low, almost hesitant. I smiled. "If you need anything else, I'm here." Without waiting for a response, I left the room, closing the door softly behind me. I went back to my desk, trying to ignore the quickening of my heartbeat. It was just a coffee. I was just being polite, right? But the way he looked at me, so vulnerable, so human. I tried to push those thoughts away, focusing on my work. It didn't make sense to dwell on it. He was my boss, and I was there to work, not to. I couldn't even finish the thought before feeling my face heat up. I shook my head, trying to pull myself together. But that day, every time I passed by the slightly open door, I saw him holding the mug, staring at the steam rising from the coffee, lost in thought. There was a softness in his expression that I had never seen before, and it moved me in a way I didn't expect. The days continued like that. I would leave the coffee, and he would accept it in silence. There were no conversations, just that quiet ritual that, somehow, made me feel a little closer to him. Alexander remained distant, always absorbed in work, always looking out the window during moments of silence. But little by little, I began to notice subtle changes. Sometimes, he would murmur a "thank you" so softly that I almost didn't hear it. Other times, he would look at me a second longer before returning to work. And there was one day when I could almost swear I saw a faint smile on his lips when he took the first sip of coffee. I didn't know what was happening to me. It didn't make sense for me to care so much. But I wanted to see him smile again. I wanted to understand what he was hiding behind that rigid posture, behind those sad eyes. And the more I tried to convince myself that it was just curiosity, the more I knew it wasn't just that. I was starting to care. Much more than I should. One afternoon I was organizing documents on the shelf when I heard a different sound coming from his office. It wasn't the usual silence, nor the cold tone he used in meetings. It was a low murmur, heavy with sadness. "I know, Mom. I can't go this year. I'm sorry." My hand stopped mid-movement. The door was slightly open, and I saw him sitting at his desk, the phone pressed to his ear, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He looked small. "I know. Tell her I'm sorry." "Happy birthday, Mom." There was a long pause before he hung up the phone, letting it fall onto the desk. He stayed there, motionless, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling slightly. My heart ached, and an overwhelming urge to go in there and hug him took over me. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know why he was so sad. But I wanted to ease that pain. I wanted to be part of his world. I wanted to break through that coldness, to cross the barriers he had built around himself. I wanted to see him smile. And at that moment, I realized that it wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just concern. I was falling in love with Alexander Beaumont, and that scared me deeply. There was a long pause before he hung up the phone, letting it fall onto the desk. He stayed there, motionless, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling slightly. My heart tightened, and an overwhelming urge to go in there and hug him took over me. I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know why he was so sad. But I wanted to ease that pain. I wanted to be a part of his world. I wanted to break through that coldness, to cross the barriers he had built around himself. I wanted to see him smile. And at that moment, I realized that I wasn't just curious. It wasn't just concern. I was falling in love with Alexander Beaumont. And it scared me deeply. I didn't know what to do with what I was feeling. It was strange, intense, and unexpected. Every morning, when I walked into that silent office, my heart beat faster when I saw him standing by the window, always so still, so distant. And I kept leaving the fresh coffee on his desk, hoping for those brief moments when our eyes would meet, trying to decipher the mystery behind those sad eyes. But Alexander didn't let anyone get close. He kept his distance, spoke little, always politely but coldly. There was no smile, no anger, nothing. It was as if he had completely shut himself off from the world. I wanted to change that, and the opportunity came unexpectedly. It was on a Friday afternoon when a snowstorm started suddenly. I was so focused on organizing documents that I only realized the gravity of the situation when everyone started leaving in a hurry, talking about the traffic jams and snow-covered streets. I turned off my computer and went to get my coat, but when I looked out the window, I saw that the city was completely white. The strong wind blew the snowflakes against the glass, forming icy whirlwinds. I sighed. There was no way to get home. Public transportation was stopped, and the streets were already blocked. I would have to wait for the storm to ease. When I turned around, I saw Alexander still sitting at his desk, his expression vacant as he stared at the computer screen. He didn't seem concerned about the chaos outside. In fact, it looked like he hadn't even noticed. I took a deep breath before approaching his door. "Mr. Beaumont, are you staying here until the storm passes?" He slowly lifted his eyes, as if waking up from a trance. "Storm?" Pointing to the window, I replied. "The snowstorm. It's pretty strong. The whole city has stopped." Alexander looked at the window, but his face remained expressionless. "Oh, yes. I hadn't noticed." I was surprised. How could he not have noticed? The city was literally disappearing under the snow. "Do you need help with anything?" "No, I'm used to staying late." He looked away, turning back to his computer screen. "But you should go home before it gets worse." I hesitated, looking at the storm outside. "I won't be able to get back now. I think I'm stuck here." Alexander was silent for a moment, then sighed softly. "In that case, I'll take you home." My eyes widened. "What? No, you don't have to bother. I can wait." "I insist." He stood up, grabbing his coat with slow, almost tired movements. "It wouldn't be right to leave you here." I wanted to protest, but something in his voice stopped me. There was a calm firmness, almost resigned, as if he had made a decision and there was nothing I could do to change it. I nodded, trying not to show the anxiety growing inside me. "All right, thank you." While we waited for the elevator, the silence was uncomfortable. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't know how to start. I glanced at him and noticed that he was standing perfectly still, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the elevator door. He looked so alone. We walked out into the snow-covered garage where his car was parked. A black sedan, elegant and impeccably clean, like everything about him. Alexander opened the passenger door for me before getting into the driver's side. As soon as we settled in, the silence returned. He drove carefully, his eyes focused on the slippery road. I wanted to thank him, to start a conversation, but I was too nervous. I couldn't stop glancing at him, trying to read his always serious expression. Then, without warning, he broke the silence. "Do you always help people like that?" I looked at him, surprised. What do you mean? That day, when you helped Michael pick up the papers he dropped. His voice was calm, almost curious. I thought it was a kind gesture. Oh, so he had seen it. I smiled, trying to ease the tension. It was nothing. I just don't like seeing people struggle alone when I can help. There was a pause before he murmured, Interesting, interesting? Yes. He kept his eyes on the road, his voice low. It's not something you see often, at least not in the office. That sentence echoed in my head. Something about his tone sounded sad. I knew I shouldn't ask, but the words slipped out before I could stop myself. Have you always been so reserved? He went so still that for a moment I thought I had crossed a line. But then he sighed, the sound so soft I barely heard it. Let's just say, I learned not to depend on anyone. I looked at him, trying to understand what he meant by that, but Alexander didn't explain. His face was expressionless, but his eyes held that same melancholic gleam as always. And then, for the first time, he looked away from the road and looked at me. You're different, Emily. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt that warmth rising inside my chest. I didn't expect that. Different? Yes. He looked back at the road, gripping the steering wheel slightly tighter. You smile, you care, you help people, without expecting anything in return. I didn't know what to say. My face grew hot, and I silently thanked the dim light in the car. I don't think it's that rare. He didn't reply, but his face tensed, his eyes fixed on the snow falling outside. Then he murmured, so softly I almost didn't hear. It is for me. The car fell silent again, but I knew something had changed. For the first time, Alexander had let his guard down, just a little. And I realized that I wanted to see more. I wanted to understand that sadness, that emptiness in his eyes. I wanted to know the real Alexander Beaumont. I was falling more and more in love. Since that night in the snowstorm, something had changed between us. We didn't talk much or share confidences, but there was a silent understanding every time our eyes met. It was as if Alexander had allowed me to get a little closer. Just enough for me to see that behind that cold facade was someone too hurt to risk feeling anything. I continued with the small gestures. I left fresh coffee on his desk every morning, organized his documents with care, always trying to make his day a little less heavy. He never mentioned it, but I started to notice that he expected the coffee, holding the mug for a moment before drinking, as if the warmth helped him wake up from something dark. And slowly, he began to reciprocate. Not with words, but with small, unexpected actions. One morning, I found a golden pen on my desk. It was beautiful, sophisticated, with my name engraved in delicate letters. I knew immediately where it came from. No one else in that office would have thought of that. I looked at the slightly open door to Alexander's office, feeling my heart race. I walked in slowly, holding the pen in my hand. Mr. Beaumont? He looked up from his computer, his shoulders tense as if expecting a complaint. Yes. Thank you for the pen. It's very beautiful. Alexander blinked, seeming surprised. He didn't respond right away, and for a moment I thought he was going to deny it, but then he looked away, shuffling the papers on his desk. I thought, it might help with your work. I smiled, feeling a gentle warmth spread through my chest. It did. Thank you very much. He nodded once, his face turned toward the window. His shoulders were a little less rigid. I wanted to say something more, to break that uncomfortable silence, but I didn't want to push him. I realized that for Alexander, every gesture, every word was an effort. As if he were relearning how to be human after spending so long living as a shadow. I left his office in silence, but the smile stayed on my face for the rest of the day. Over time, other subtle gestures began to appear. When he noticed that I was overwhelmed, he would postpone some tasks, saying he could handle them himself. When I arrived in the morning, I found my desk spotless, without the pile of disorganized documents that used to mysteriously appear. But what really caught me by surprise was the day I found a simple note next to my coffee cup. The handwriting was firm and elegant, with no signature, but I would recognize that reserved gesture anywhere. Thank you for everything you do, A.B. I stared at the note for a long time, my heart racing. It was the first time he expressed gratitude directly, even if anonymously. It was a small step, but for Alexander, it was gigantic. I felt my eyes welling up, but I blinked quickly, trying to pull myself together. I didn't want anyone to see how much that simple piece of paper meant to me. I carefully placed the note in my drawer, making sure not to crumple it. From time to time, I would open the drawer just to look at it, feeling an inexplicable joy. And that's how I realized how much he was changing, and how much I was falling in love. But the changes also brought conflicts. The closer Alexander allowed himself to get, the more he seemed to struggle against it. It was as if he wanted to open the door, but was afraid of what might come in. I began to notice his mood swings. One day he would greet me with a subtle nod and even ask polite questions about my weekend. The next day he would go back to being distant and cold, barely responding to my good morning. I didn't know how to handle it. One day I would leave the office floating with happiness. The next, I would go home with a knot in my stomach, wondering what I had done wrong. But I didn't give up. I knew it was a slow process, that he was trying. I saw the effort in his eyes, in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't noticing. And then his birthday came. I found out the date by accident while organizing some old documents. There was no mention of a celebration, no event scheduled. It was just a lonely date on a piece of paper. I kept thinking about what to do. I didn't want to pressure him or make him feel uncomfortable, but I couldn't ignore it. Not after everything he had done for me, even if in such subtle ways. That morning, I left the coffee as usual, but beside the cup, I placed a simple card. Nothing extravagant, just happy birthday written by hand. I was nervous all day, waiting for his reaction. But Alexander didn't mention anything. He kept working in silence, his expression unreadable. When the day ended, he said goodbye with a quick nod and left without a word. I stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling foolish. Maybe I had crossed the line. Maybe he didn't want to remember the date. Maybe. My thoughts were interrupted when I looked at his desk. The cup was empty, but the card wasn't there. He had taken it with him. A smile appeared on my lips involuntarily. He didn't need to say anything. That already said it all. Alexander was changing. Slowly, hesitantly, but he was. And I knew I was completely involved. It wasn't just curiosity, nor pity. It was something deep, a desire to see him happy, to break through that cold loneliness that surrounded him. I wanted to be there for him. I wanted to help him find himself again. And deep down, I knew there was no turning back. I knew my feelings for Alexander were inevitable and growing more intense. There was no fighting them. It was one of those realizations that comes slowly, like a timid sun behind the clouds. First, I began to look forward to the mornings just to see him standing by the window, that elegant profile against Toronto's gray light. Then, I started noticing the small changes in his expression, the way his eyes softened when I left the coffee on his desk, or how his voice became a little less cold when he said, "Thank you." But what really confirmed everything was the pain I felt on the days he pulled away. Alexander had this habit of building walls around himself, especially when he felt he was getting too close. It was as if he were afraid of something he couldn't name, and it hurt me in a way I didn't know how to explain. At first, I tried to overlook it. After all, he was trying to change. I saw it in the subtle gestures, the simple notes, the golden pen that I still used every day. But the mood swings were hard to bear. One day, he seemed open, approachable. The next, he looked at me coldly, as if we had never shared anything. And then the day came when I couldn't hold it all inside anymore. It was a particularly difficult afternoon. The morning had been wonderful. He greeted me with an unexpectedly warm, "Good morning," asked about my family, even smiled when I told a funny story about my younger sister. I spent the rest of the day floating, believing that finally the walls were coming down. But then, without any apparent reason, he changed. He went back to being that distant, cold, unreachable man. He didn't look in my direction, barely responded when I asked about the schedule, and left without saying goodbye. I stood there, staring at the closed door, a knot in my stomach. I couldn't take this emotional roller coaster anymore. I needed to understand what was happening. So the next day, I decided to confront him. I waited until the end of the day, when the office was already empty. I took a deep breath before lightly knocking on his office door. "Mr. Beaumont, can I speak with you?" He looked up from his computer, surprised. "Yes. What's wrong?" I walked in, closing the door behind me. My heart was racing, but I couldn't back out now. "I need I need to understand what's going on, he frowned. I don't understand. Did something go wrong at work? No, it's not about work. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. It's about us. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. He tensed, as if he'd been hit by a blast of cold wind. Us? Yes. My hands were trembling, so I hid them in my coat pockets. One day, you're kind, considerate, and the next, you act like I don't exist. I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know what you want from me. Alexander looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't want anything from you. That hurt more than I expected. I tried to ignore the pain in my chest and took a step forward. Then why do you keep letting me in, only to push me away afterward? He stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the window. When he spoke, his voice was low, hoarse. Because I don't know how to do this, Emily. Do what? Care. My heart stopped for a second. What do you mean? Alexander ran a hand over his face, the gesture so human, so vulnerable, that I almost cried right there. I don't know how to let people get close. I don't know how to trust. I'm not asking you to trust me. I just want to understand why you always pull back when it feels like we're getting closer. He was silent for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he murmured, because it's easier this way. That made my blood boil. Easier? It's easier to pretend you don't feel anything? It's easier to treat people like they're disposable? He flinched, as if I had slapped him. You don't understand, then make me understand. My voice was louder than I intended. I'm trying. Since the first day, I've been trying to understand you, Alexander. But you don't make it easy. You don't let anyone in. And my voice broke. I'm hurting myself trying. He looked at me then, his blue eyes wide, filled with something I had never seen before. Fear. I don't want to hurt you. Then stop running away. He clenched his jaw, his face a mask of restrained pain. I don't know how. Tell me why. Tell me what happened to you. Alexander looked away, his shoulders trembling slightly. My father. He left when I was a child. His voice was low, unsteady. My mother fell into depression and she withdrew from everything. I was alone. I grew up alone. I learned not to depend on anyone, not to trust anyone. Because every time I let someone in, they left. My heart tightened as I heard that. Suddenly, everything made sense. Alexander, I don't want to feel that again. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. I don't want to get attached to someone, just to lose them afterward. I stepped closer, my eyes filled with tears. I wanted to touch him, to hug him, but I stayed where I was. I'm not going anywhere. He opened his eyes, and tears were on the verge of falling. I can't risk it. I can't. I took another step forward. You don't have to risk anything right now. Just let me stay by your side. Alexander looked at me, his face vulnerable, stripped of all the masks he used to wear. For a moment, I saw the man behind the coldness, the boy who had been abandoned, the adult who had learned not to feel anything just to survive. And then he closed his eyes and nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. All right. I sighed, feeling the tears slide down my face. It's going to be okay, Alexander. He didn't respond, but he took a step toward me, his shoulders finally relaxing. I didn't hug him, didn't push him. I just stood there, close enough for him to know he was no longer alone. And for the first time, Alexander Beaumont didn't try to run away. Snow was falling softly over Toronto, covering the city with a white, silent blanket. Alexander's office was lit by a golden, gentle light, different from the cold brightness of the lonely days he used to spend there. I was sitting on the couch near the window, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching him as he finished organizing some papers. I would never get tired of that sight. Alexander with his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, his hair slightly messy. He looked so human now, so approachable, so mine. Are you going to spend the whole night there, spying on me? He asked, a slight smile on his lips, without lifting his eyes from the documents. I laughed, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders. I'm just enjoying the view. Alexander finally looked up, his blue eyes shining with that warmth I now knew so well. I thought the city view was more interesting. Not even close. He shook his head, laughing softly as he put the papers away in a folder. Every movement of his was relaxed, carefree, a living proof of the transformation I had witnessed over the past months. The man who was once cold and distant was now there, smiling at me with a tenderness I never thought I'd see in his eyes. When he finished, he turned off the lights and walked over to me, sitting beside me on the couch. I snuggled against his chest, feeling the warmth of his body, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was a comforting, familiar sound. "Are you okay?" he asked, his fingers gently running through my hair. "I am," I sighed, looking at the snow falling outside. I was just thinking about how much things have changed. Alexander was silent for a moment, his arms tightening around me a little more. "Yes, they've changed a lot." I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Do you regret it?" He looked at me with an intensity that still took my breath away, even after all this time. "How could I regret finding you?" My eyes filled with tears. I smiled, feeling my heart overflow with love. "You know you don't have to be afraid anymore, right?" Alexander nodded, his gaze full of sincerity. "I know, you taught me that, every day." I kissed him softly, tasting the familiar warmth of his lips, the heat of his hands holding my face. Every touch, every word, every gesture was a silent promise that he wouldn't run away anymore. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, a soft smile on his lips. "I love you, Emily." My heart raced, as it always did when he said those words. I knew how much it cost him to say it, how much he had fought against his own fears to open up like that. I hugged him tightly, burying my face in his neck, breathing in his scent, his warmth. "I love you too, Alexander. I always have." We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, while the snow continued to fall outside, covering the city in silence. But there, in his arms, I had never felt so safe, so at peace. Alexander Beaumont had finally let someone in, and I knew that, no matter what happened, I would never let him go. We were together, finally.
What did you think of the story? Leave a comment below. Let us know which city you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more stories.